They laughed at his rifle. They called it a toy. They told him it belonged in a hunting cabin, not on a battlefield. For 6 weeks, Second Lieutenant John George heard the jokes, the insults, and the whispers. A mail-order rifle, a civilian weapon, a strange little scope that nobody trusted. But 4 days later, that same rifle would be tied to one of the most terrifying sniper hunts in the jungles of Guadalcanal. 11 Japanese snipers were hiding in the trees. 14 American soldiers had already been killed in just 72 hours, and the men who mocked John George were about to realize something too late. The rifle was never the dangerous part. The dangerous part was the man holding it. At 9:17 in the morning on January 22, 1943, John George lay inside the broken remains of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. The air was heavy. The jungle was wet. The smell of mud, sweat, gun oil, and rotting vegetation hung around him like a blanket. Somewhere far away, artillery rolled across the island. But George was not watching the horizon. He was not looking at the trail. He was staring through a small scope at one banyan tree roughly 240 yards away. To anyone else, it looked like just another piece of jungle. Branches, leaves, shadows, nothing more. But George had been staring long enough to know when something was wrong. And then he saw it. A branch moved. There was no wind. George did not blink. He did not shift. He did not call anyone over. He simply watched. The branch moved again. Then a shape began to separate itself from the tree. A man, high in the branches, hidden in the fork of a banyan tree, a Japanese sniper. And he was, looking the other way. That was the first mistake. But before George pulled the trigger, you need to understand why nobody believed in him. Because when John George arrived with that rifle, the army did not see a weapon. They saw a joke. His Winchester Model 70 was not standard issue. It was not the weapon every other man carried. Most American infantrymen in his battalion carried the M1 Garand. Semi-automatic. 8 rounds. Military approved. Built for war. George's rifle was different. Bolt action. 5 rounds. Personally bought. A rifle built for precision, not volume. It had a Lyman Alaskan scope mounted to it, the kind of optic most soldiers had never used in combat. To George, the rifle was a tool. To everyone else, it looked like something a rich hunter might order from a catalog. That was why the jokes started. One officer called it a toy. Other platoon leaders mocked it as his mail-order sweetheart. When he first showed it to an armorer back in Tennessee, the man asked if George planned to use it on deer or Germans. George answered that he planned to use it on the Japanese. Nobody laughed harder than the men who had never seen what he could do with it. George had not bought that rifle for style. He had saved 2 years of National Guard pay to get it. Every part of it mattered to him. The balance, the trigger, the scope, the way it settled into his shoulder. He knew the rifle because he had earned it long before the war ever gave him a reason to prove it. Back home in Illinois, George had been a champion marksman. He understood distance the way other men understood roads. He knew how wind pushed a bullet. He knew how breathing moved the barrel. He knew how a rushed trigger pull could ruin everything. At long range, most men aimed and hoped. George studied, measured, waited, and then fired. But paper targets do not shoot back. Paper targets do not hide above you in the trees. Paper targets do not wait for you to lower your guard before putting a bullet through your neck. Guadalcanal was not a shooting range. Guadalcanal was a living nightmare. The Marines had landed there in August of 1942. They had taken Henderson Field. They had held it through attacks, shelling, disease, hunger, heat, and exhaustion. But the island was not finished. The Japanese were still everywhere, in hills, in ravines, in bunkers, in the jungle, in places maps could not explain. By late December, George's unit, the 132nd Infantry Regiment, arrived to continue the brutal work. They were not stepping into a clean battlefield. They were stepping into a place that had already chewed men apart. Mount Austin was one of the first nightmares. The Japanese had built strong defensive positions. There, bunkers, firing lanes, hidden approaches. Every yard had to be taken with blood. George's battalion fought for more than 2 weeks. Men were killed. Hundreds were wounded. The jungle, the Japanese, and the terrain seemed to work together against them. And after all that fighting, John George had still not fired his Winchester in combat. Not once. To the men who mocked him, That probably proved their point. The rifle was dead weight, a private obsession, a strange civilian toy carried by a man who should have known better. Then came Point Cruz, and Point Cruz changed everything. The groves west of the Matanikau River were different from the fortified hill positions. There were no obvious bunkers to storm, no single trench to attack, no clear target to destroy. The Japanese had melted into the trees. They climbed before dawn. They hid in the branches. They used vines, leaves, shadows, and height as cover. From the ground they were almost impossible to see, but they could see everything. They watched trails. They watched water points. They watched supply routes. They waited until an American soldier paused, stood, bent down, or looked in the wrong direction. Then one shot cracked from the trees, and another man fell. One American was killed while filling canteens at a creek. 2 more died during a patrol. Another soldier was shot through the neck after his patrol had passed the same tree more than once. That was the horror. The enemy was not ahead of them. The enemy was above them. And by the time anyone understood where the shot had come from, the sniper was already hidden again. In 3 days, 14 men from the 192nd Infantry were killed by Japanese snipers in the Point Cruz groves. 14. Not in a charge, not in a firefight, not in some massive assault. 14 men taken by invisible shooters hiding in the trees. The effect on the battalion was immediate. Men stopped trusting the jungle. They stopped trusting silence. They stopped trusting shade. Every tree became a threat. Every branch could hide a rifle barrel. Every movement overhead could be death. The Sayao commander needed an answer. He did not need theory. He did not need another patrol walking into fire. He needed someone who could look into that green wall and find the men inside it. That was when John George was called in. Not because they respected his rifle. Not because they suddenly believed the jokes were wrong, but because men were dying, and nobody else had solved the problem. George stood before his commander and explained what he could do. State champion, experienced long-range shooter, capable of tight groups at distances where most soldiers were just trying to hit anything. The commander listened, then gave him until morning. Prove it. That was the entire offer. No praise, no apology, no confidence, just one chance. Either George and his mail-order rifle would end the killing, or the rifle would remain a joke. That night, George cleaned the Winchester like a man preparing for a final exam. He did not rush. He checked the action, the scope mount, the barrel, the ammunition. The rifle had crossed the ocean and survived the humidity of the island. It had been packed, shipped, handled, stored, and finally delivered to him in a wooden crate marked fragile. But now it was no longer a fragile thing. It was going to work. He loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 ammunition, the same cartridge used by the Garand. But in George's rifle, there would be no fast 8-round burst, no quick spray of fire, no second chance wasted by panic. Every shot would have to matter. 1 shot, 1 bolt, 1 decision. Before sunrise on January 22nd, George moved toward the old Japanese bunker. He brought no large team with him, no crowd, no curious officers, no men standing behind him whispering. Just his rifle, a canteen, and enough ammunition to stay in the fight. That was deliberate. A crowd creates movement. Movement draws eyes. Eyes draw fire. George understood something most of the battalion was only beginning to learn. In a sniper duel, being noticed can kill you before being shot does. He settled into the ruined bunker and looked out toward the groves. The Lyman Alaskan scope was not powerful by modern standards, only 2.5 power magnification. But in that jungle, even a little glass could change everything. It could show him a shoulder where others saw bark, a hand where others saw leaves, a rifle barrel where others saw shadow. George began scanning, slowly, left to right, top to bottom, then again and again. The jungle tried to confuse him. Leaves moved, insects flashed, birds shifted, shadows changed with the light. The longer he looked, the more everything seemed alive. And that was exactly the problem. A hidden sniper did not need to vanish. He only needed to look natural. At 9:17, the first unnatural movement appeared. A branch shifted in a banyan tree about 240 yards away. There was no wind. George stayed on it. Then it moved again. Not much, just enough. Through the scope, a shape slowly became human. A Japanese sniper was sitting high in the tree, positioned in a fork where branches met. He was facing east, watching a trail American troops had been using. He had probably been waiting for hours, maybe since before dawn. He had no idea the man with the mocked rifle had already found him. George adjusted. The shot was not simple. A man in a tree is not a clean range target. Branches break the outline. Leaves distort the shape. Distance and angle work against the shooter, and if George missed, the sniper would disappear or fire back. Worse, the shot would tell every Japanese sniper nearby where George was hidden. But George had not waited 6 weeks to panic now. He settled his breathing, let the rifle rest into his shoulder, found the shape through the glass, then squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked. The jungle swallowed the sound for half a heartbeat. Then the sniper jerked and fell. He dropped through the branches, striking limbs on the way down before hitting the ground near the base of the tree. 1 shot, 1 kill. George worked the bolt. The empty casing flew out. A fresh round slid into the chamber. But he did not celebrate. He did not lift his head. He did not call out, because he knew the first shot was only the beginning. Japanese snipers often worked in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 observer. If he had just killed the shooter, the second man could still be watching. And now that second man knew someone was hunting them. George stayed still and searched the nearby trees. Slowly, carefully. The scope was limited, so he had to earn every detail. Too fast, and he would miss movement. Too slow, and the enemy might escape. At 9:43, he found the second man. Another tree, roughly 60 yards north of the first, lower in the branches, moving down the trunk. The soldier had heard the shot and understood the danger. He was trying to leave the tree before the American could find him, but he had already made his last movement. George tracked him through the scope, led him slightly, fired. The second sniper fell backward, his rifle crashing through the branches before his body hit the jungle floor. 2 shots, 2 snipers dead. The rifle they had called a toy had just done in minutes what patrols had failed to do for days, but the jungle did not go quiet, because George was winning. It became more dangerous. Every surviving sniper now had proof that the Americans had someone who could see them, someone who could reach them, someone who could turn their hiding places into traps. George reloaded, carefully. His hands were steady. This was still marksmanship, but it was no longer like any competition he had ever known. On a range, a missed target stays paper. Here, a missed target shoots back. At 11:21, the jungle reminded him. A bullet slammed into a sandbag just 6 inches from his head. Dirt sprayed across his face. George rolled left and flattened himself against the bunker wall. For a moment, he did nothing. That is what saved him. Most men would have jerked up. Most men would have fired toward the sound. Most men would have revealed themselves trying to answer fear with noise. George waited. The shot had come from the southwest. Different angle, different sniper, a man who had seen something, or guessed something, or simply fired at the most likely place an American marksman would be. George counted the seconds, then the minutes. He waited 3 full minutes before moving. When he returned to the firing slit, he moved by inches. He raised the scope and began searching southwest. He knew the doctrine. A sniper fires, then moves. But in jungle, this dense moving is difficult. Branches, vines, trunks, and cover all limit choices. Sometimes a sniper thinks he has relocated when he has only changed branches. At 11:38, George found him. 3rd tree from the left in a cluster of banyans, high up, partially hidden. The Japanese sniper had shifted position after firing, but he had not left the tree. It was a small mistake. Against John George, small mistakes were enough. The crosshair settled. The rifle fired. The 3rd sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers, 5 men hidden in the trees, 5 threats removed from the groves, 5 reasons American soldiers could breathe a little easier. And that was when the story began to spread. Men who had mocked the rifle now wanted to see it. Some wanted to watch George work. Some wanted to stand near the bunker and witness the strange rifle in action. George refused. He understood what they did not. Spectators do not make a sniper better. They make him easier to find. Attention draws fire. And he had no interest in dying just because the battalion had finally decided to respect him, so he stayed alone, quiet, focused, patient. By the afternoon, the Japanese changed tactics. They stopped making obvious movements during daylight. They froze in their trees. They waited. They adapted. George spent hours scanning branches and finding nothing. No twitch, no mistake, no exposed shoulder, no careless shift. That silence told him more than noise ever could. The remaining Japanese snipers were learning, and the next time they moved, they would be harder to kill. At 1600 hours, George returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. This was the same officer who had told him to leave the Winchester in his tent, the same man who had wanted him to carry a real weapon. But now the mockery was gone. Morris did not joke. He did not ask if the toy still worked. He simply wanted George back in, position at dawn. That was the only apology a battlefield gives. A new order, a new mission, a new trust. And George understood what it meant. In one day, he had gone from the man with the strange rifle to the man the battalion needed alive. If you are watching this story, and you believe men like this should not be forgotten, hit the like button and subscribe. It takes 1 second, but it helps keep stories like John George's alive. Now watch what happened next, because the Japanese were about to stop hiding and start hunting him. January 23rd began with rain. Not a soft rain, a heavy tropical downpour that hammered the leaves and turned the ground into mud. Visibility collapsed. Beyond 100 yards, the jungle became a grey wall. George could not work in that. No one could. So he waited. The rain covered sound. It hid movement. It washed tracks. It gave the Japanese a chance to climb, shift, and reset without being heard. George knew that. He also knew that when the rain stopped, someone would probably already be in position. At 8:15, the downpour began to fade. At 8:45, the trees became visible enough to search. George raised the scope. His eyes moved across the canopy. Again, slow. Again, careful. Again, looking for the one thing that did not belong. At 9:12, he found the first sniper of the day. The Japanese soldier had used the rain well. He had climbed while the storm masked his movement. He had chosen a tree farther out than the others, nearly 290 yards away. That was smart. They were testing George's range. They wanted to know how far the Winchester could reach. George gave them the answer. He adjusted for distance, controlled his breathing. Fired. The sniper fell. 6 confirmed. But the shot triggered an immediate response. At 9:57, mortar rounds began landing near the bunker. The first ones were short, then closer again. The Japanese had located his position, maybe by muzzle flash, maybe by sound, maybe by observation. It did not matter. The next rounds would be on top of him. George grabbed the Winchester and ran. He moved north along the tree line and dove into a shell crater. Seconds later, the bunker he had been using disappeared under explosions, dirt, smoke, and flying debris. If he had waited even a little longer, the war would have ended for him right there. But George did not freeze. He relocated. About 120 yards north, he found cover behind a fallen tree. It was not as solid as the bunker. It was not as protected, but it offered a view of the groves. That was enough. He settled in and resumed the hunt. Now the fight was different. The Japanese knew he existed. They knew he was killing their snipers. They knew roughly where he had been. And now they were using more than rifles to kill him. This was no longer a marksman removing hidden targets. This was a duel. The hunter had become the hunted. At 14:23, George killed his 7th sniper. At 15:41, he killed his 8th. That sniper had chosen height, almost 90 feet up in a banyan tree. The concealment was good, but when the sun shifted, the body created a faint silhouette against the brighter sky. A lesser shooter might have missed it. George did not. One shot. The man fell. By evening, George had been in position for 9 hours. His body was tired. His eyes were strained. His uniform was soaked with sweat, rain, and mud. But the numbers spoke for themselves. 8 confirmed snipers in 2 days, 12 rounds fired, 8 kills, 4 misses. Captain Morris wanted the report. George gave it without drama. He was not trying to sound like a legend. He was trying to finish a job. That night, alone with the Winchester, George cleaned the rifle again. He understood the arithmetic. Intelligence believed there had been 11 Japanese snipers in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were dead. That left 3. And those 3 would be different. They were not the careless ones. They were not the men who moved too soon. They were not the men who trusted height too much or stayed too long in the wrong tree. They were the survivors, the ones who had watched 2 days of death and learned from it. They knew. George could see into the trees. They knew he could hit at distance. They knew he changed positions. They knew he waited. And somewhere out in the dark, those remaining snipers were thinking about him too. George loaded 5 fresh rounds into the Winchester and tried to sleep. But sleep did not come. At 3:00 in the morning, he stopped trying. He sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap while rain began falling again outside. He knew the next day would not be like the first 2. The easy mistakes were gone. The obvious targets were gone. The remaining men would not simply hide and hope. They would set traps. They would use bait. They would try to turn his patience against him. And when morning came, John George would step into the deadliest part of the hunt. Because now, the last snipers in Point Cruz were no longer waiting to be found. They were waiting for him to make one mistake. The rain began again before sunrise. At 4:15 in the morning, water started tapping against the canvas of George's tent. By 5:30 it was no longer a drizzle. It was a full tropical downpour, the kind of rain that turned the jungle floor into black mud, the kind of rain that made every leaf shine, the kind of rain that covered footsteps, erased sound, and gave a careful enemy the perfect chance to move. Most men would have delayed. Most men would have waited for clear visibility. But John George understood something the remaining Japanese snipers understood too. Rain was not just weather. Rain was cover. And if he waited too long, the enemy would use it first. So before the morning fully opened, George made a decision that may have saved his life. He did not return to the bunker. The bunker was gone. He did not return to the fallen tree. That position had already been used. He did not go where the Japanese expected the American with the scoped Winchester to appear. Instead, he moved, quietly, carefully, south of his previous position. He found a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used weeks earlier as a machine gun nest. It was not comfortable. It was not clean. It was not safe. But it gave him elevation. It gave him cover. And most importantly, it gave him surprise. Because by now, the last Japanese snipers were not just hiding from John George. They were studying him. They had watched their own men fall. They knew he could hit them from distance. They knew he could wait longer than most men. They knew he did not shoot at every shadow. And that made the next fight far more dangerous than the first. At 7:43, the rain weakened into a thin drizzle. Visibility slowly returned. The jungle came back in layers. First the nearest leaves, then the trunks, then the darker shapes deeper inside the groves. George settled behind the rocks and brought the Winchester to his shoulder. His uniform was soaked. His body was tired. His eyes had been strained from 2 days of searching trees that wanted to hide men inside them. But his mind was sharp. 11 Japanese snipers had been reported in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were dead. That left 3. And George knew exactly what that meant. The easy ones were gone. The careless ones were gone. The men who moved too soon, climbed too high, or trusted the wrong branch were gone. The remaining snipers were the survivors. They were the most patient, the most careful, the ones who had learned from every body that hit the jungle floor. At 8:17, George found what looked like sniper number 9. A Japanese soldier was hidden in a palm tree about 190 yards away. He was not high in the canopy like the others had been. He was lower, maybe 40 feet up, almost buried inside the fronds. It was a smart position. From ground level, he would have been almost invisible. The palm leaves wrapped around him like natural camouflage. But George was not at ground level. From the rocks, he had a downward angle. Through the scope, he could see part of the man's upper body, a shoulder, a head, enough for a shot. George settled the crosshair. His breathing slowed. The rifle became still. His finger began to take up pressure on the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. Not loud, not obvious, not something another man would notice, but wrong. The target was too available, too clear, too tempting. After 2 days of hunting snipers, George knew the final survivors would not make mistakes that simple, unless they wanted him to believe it was a mistake. He eased off the trigger, and that hesitation may have kept him alive. Because if a sniper is bait, then the real shooter is somewhere else, watching the bait, waiting for the shot, waiting for the muzzle flash, waiting for the American to reveal himself. George lowered the rifle just enough to reset his focus. Then he began searching the trees around the palm, left to right, top to bottom, branch by branch, shadow by shadow. He checked every position that could cover the palm, every tree with a line of sight toward the old fallen tree position, every dark shape that seemed too still. The sniper in the palm remained in view, still there, still killable, still tempting. But George did not take the bait. For 11 minutes, he searched. 11 minutes of ignoring the easy shot. 11 minutes of trusting discipline over instinct. 11 minutes that separated a marksman from a dead man. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree about 80 yards northwest of the palm, nearly 90 feet up, deep in a tangle of branches and vines. A Japanese sniper was hidden in a perfect position. From 3 sides, he was almost completely concealed, but he had a clean line of sight toward George's previous location, the fallen tree. That was the trap. The man in the palm was the lure. The man in the banyan was the killer. If George had fired at the palm immediately, the real sniper would have seen the flash, heard the report, and sent a bullet back before George could fully understand what had happened. George now had 2 targets, 1 visible decoy, 1 real threat, and only a bolt-action rifle. He could not spray fire. He could not fire twice instantly. Every shot came with a delay. Fire, work the bolt, find the next target, fire again. In that delay, a good sniper could disappear, or kill him. So George made a choice that turned the trap back on the men who set it. He aimed at the decoy, the Japanese soldier in the palm tree. He settled the rifle, controlled his breath, fired. The decoy jerked and fell through the fronds. But George did not watch him drop. He was already moving the rifle, swinging toward the banyan, because the real sniper would react. He would turn toward the sound. He would shift. He would search. And, in that tiny movement, he would reveal himself. George caught it, a slight change in the dark shape, a body turning inside the branches. The Winchester settled. George fired before the sniper completed the movement. The man fell from the banyan, his rifle tumbling after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. The trap had failed. But victory lasted only seconds, because now George's location was exposed. He grabbed the Winchester and moved immediately. No pause, no celebration, no second look. He ran east along the rock line and dropped into a drainage ditch roughly 40 yards away. Mud swallowed his elbows. Rainwater soaked his chest. He pressed himself down and waited. 6 seconds later, machine gun fire ripped across the rocks where he had just been lying. Bullets smashed stone. Dust and fragments jumped into the air. The burst lasted 17 seconds. 17 seconds of violence poured into an empty position. If George had stayed to admire his shot, if he had smiled, if he had waited even 1 breath longer, he would have died there. When the firing stopped, he did not move. He counted, slowly, to 60. Only then did he crawl out and relocate again. This time, he found a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. It was miserable, cold, muddy, deep enough that the water rose to his chest when he slid inside. But it hid him, and hiding mattered more than comfort. George rested the Winchester on the crater rim and returned to the scope. 10 snipers were now dead. 1 remained. And that final sniper, George knew, would be the most dangerous man in the grove. If you're still watching, don't blink now, because this is where George almost made the one mistake that could have ended everything. For almost an hour, George searched the trees. Every branch looked suspicious. Every patch of shadow could hide a face. Every dark shape might have been a rifle barrel. But something felt different. The jungle canopy gave him nothing. No movement, no silhouette, no strange branch shift, nothing. Then, at 9:47, George realized why. The last sniper was not in the trees. He was on the ground, and he was moving toward him. At the edge of George's vision, about 60 yards to the south, something low shifted through the undergrowth. Not walking, crawling. A shape moving through ferns, vines, and fallen branches. The Japanese sniper had changed the game. He was not using height anymore. He was stalking through the jungle floor, following the path George had used when he escaped the machine gun fire. This man had watched, or studied the signs. Either way, he was not guessing. He was hunting George the way George had hunted the others. George stayed motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was ready, but the angle was terrible. The crater rim blocked his view. If he rose too soon, the sniper might see him. If he waited too long, the man might disappear. At 9:52, the Japanese soldier stopped about 40 yards from the rocks. He studied the position, slowly, carefully. He was looking for the American, looking for movement, looking for the scoped rifle, looking for the one mistake George had avoided all morning. George waited. That is the part most people never understand about this kind of fight. The hardest thing is not pulling the trigger. The hardest thing is not pulling it. At 9:58, the sniper began moving again, 35 yards from the rocks, then 30, then 25. He was approaching the south side, the same direction George had used during his escape. George understood the tactic. The Japanese sniper believed George had fled from the rocks and moved east, so he was following the likely route, patiently, low to the ground, using the jungle as a shield. At 10:03, the Japanese soldier reached the rocks. He moved into the old machine gun nest and took up a position facing east, toward the drainage ditch, toward the place George should have been hiding. But George was not in the ditch. He was 38 yards away in a muddy crater, and now the Japanese sniper's back was exposed. A clean shot. Easy. Almost too easy. George had the crosshair on him. At 38 yards, he could not miss. But again, he hesitated. This sniper had survived when 10 others had died. He had watched the pattern. He had tracked George's movement. He had reached the rocks without exposing himself until the final moment. A man like that would not simply turn his back and wait to be shot, not unless there was more to the trap. George kept the man in the scope but expanded his awareness. He searched beyond the rocks, beyond the first target, beyond the obvious. At 10:06, he found the second shape. Another Japanese soldier was hidden about 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. He was not moving, not crawling, not signaling, just waiting. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch, exactly where George was supposed to be. Now George understood. There were 2 of them. The man in the rocks was bait again. The second soldier was covering him. Maybe one was the final sniper, and the other was support. Maybe these were the last 2 snipers operating as a team. Either way, George had a problem. He could not shoot both before one reacted. With a semi-automatic rifle, maybe. With the Winchester, no. One shot would reveal him, then he would have to work the bolt. By then, the second man could fire. So George chose a third option. He disappeared. Slowly, he lowered himself deeper into the muddy water, down until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester angled upward so water would not enter the barrel. Then he waited. No movement, no noise, no shot, just patience. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rock stood up. He had been watching the drainage ditch for nearly 10 minutes and seen nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to the second man behind the fallen tree. Then both soldiers began moving east, parallel to each other, about 70 yards apart. They were sweeping the escape route, trying to flush George out, trying to find the ghost who had destroyed their sniper line. But they had made one fatal assumption. They thought George was ahead of them. He was behind them. The 2 Japanese soldiers moved past the crater, their backs opened toward him. George rose from the muddy water, slowly, silently. Water ran off his uniform. Mud clung to his sleeves. The Winchester came to his shoulder. He aimed at the closer man first, the one who had been in the rocks. 42 yards away. George fired. The man dropped. George worked the bolt. The second soldier was already turning. His rifle was coming up. George swung the Winchester onto him and fired before the man could finish the motion. The second soldier fell, and with that, the Point Cruz sniper threat was broken. 11 Japanese snipers were dead. The groves that had killed 14 Americans in 3 days were finally clear. For 1 second, the jungle felt finished. Then George heard voices, Japanese voices, coming from the tree line. Multiple men, moving toward the fallen bodies. George froze. The snipers had not been alone. A patrol or recovery team was moving in. 6 men at least, maybe more. George dropped back into the water-filled crater. The mud was cold. The water pressed against his chest. He sank until only his eyes were above the surface. He held the Winchester upright, fighting to keep the barrel clear. The voices grew louder. Branches snapped, equipment rattled, men spoke in urgent tones. They reached the first body, then the second. George could hear them clearly now, though he could not understand the words. Then the voices changed direction. They were not moving back to the tree line. They were coming toward him. At 10:28, George realized what had happened. They had found his tracks, boot prints in the mud leading away from the rocks. The jungle had hidden his body. The rain had hidden his sound. The crater had hidden his position. But the mud had remembered him. George checked the rifle. 5 rounds, at least 6 Japanese soldiers. A bolt-action rifle. No support, no clean escape. The odds were bad. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim, looking down, straight at him. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still half submerged. He rose. 2 more soldiers were at the rim. He fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both dropped. Shouting erupted. More Japanese soldiers were moving in. George climbed out the north side of the crater and ran 20 yards to a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets kicked dirt from the crater. Rounds snapped into bark. Leaves shook above him. The soldiers were firing at sound and movement, not at a confirmed target. George stayed low, raised the scope, saw 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater. 50 yards out, he aimed at the lead man, fired. The soldier dropped. The second dove for cover. George now had 2 rounds left. Then he heard voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking. One group from the south, another from the east. He was about to be surrounded. And this is where a reckless man dies trying to become a legend. George did not do that. He understood the difference between courage and stupidity. He could not win a firefight against multiple soldiers with a bolt-action rifle and 2 rounds. So he broke contact. He grabbed the Winchester and ran north. Vines caught his boots. Branches tore at his face. Japanese bullets cracked past him, snapping into trees and throwing dirt from the ground. He ran for nearly 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed against the wall and listened. The voices were farther away. The Japanese had not chased hard. They were regrouping around their dead. George looked at the rifle. Mud on the stock. Water still dripping from the barrel. 2 rounds left. No stripper clips. His extra ammunition was back near the water-filled crater. Going back would be suicide. So he moved again. At 10:47, George began making his way toward the American lines. Not running now, moving low, using the ground, stopping often, listening between steps. The jungle had gone quiet again. Only distant artillery. Only dripping leaves. Only his own breathing. At 11:13, he reached the American perimeter. A sentry challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry led him through. George walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted the full account. George gave it. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against sniper targets. 11 hits. Then an unexpected firefight with Japanese infantry. More enemy soldiers killed. 2 rounds remaining. Rifle functional, but dirty. Mud in the action. Water around the barrel. Captain Morris listened to all of it. This was the same man who had once told George to leave the Winchester behind and carry a real weapon. Now that same officer told him to clean the rifle and rest. No operation the next day. The battalion was moving. The Point Cruz groves were no longer the same problem. The threat had been broken, and the rifle that had been mocked had done what everyone said it could not do. If this story deserves to be remembered, hit the like button and subscribe. Because every like tells YouTube that forgotten soldiers like John George should not disappear into silence. George returned to his tent and field-stripped the Winchester. For 2 hours, he cleaned every part. Mud from the stock, water from the metal, oil through the action, patches through the barrel until they came out clean. He checked the scope mount, adjusted the eye relief, loaded 5 fresh rounds. The rifle had been laughed at, then tested, then soaked, covered in mud, nearly destroyed by mortars and jungle fighting. But it still worked. At 1400 hours, word came down. The battalion commander wanted to see him. George walked to headquarters not knowing what waited there. A reprimand was possible. He had operated alone. He had been drawn into a firefight. He had pushed the limits of what one man with a rifle could do. But when he arrived, Captain Morris was standing with other officers. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George did not exaggerate. He said he could try. But it would require time, rifles with optics, and men who already knew how to shoot. Ferry had 14 Springfield rifles with Unertl scopes left behind by Marines. He also had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen. He wanted George to build a sniper section, train them, teach them to find hidden targets, teach them to move without giving themselves away, teach them to clear Japanese snipers from American operational areas. George accepted, but he had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved it. The mail-order rifle stayed with him, and training began on January 27th. 40 men assembled at a rough range east of Henderson Field. On paper, they were expert marksmen, but George knew paper meant almost nothing in the jungle. A target on a range does not crawl behind you. It does not use bait. It does not call mortars onto your position. It does not wait in a tree for 6 hours without moving. So George started at the beginning. Breathing, trigger control, wind, distance, support, observation, patience. He taught them how to use rocks, logs, roots, sandbags, and broken ground as shooting platforms. He taught them not to trust obvious targets. He taught them that a sniper's first job was not to shoot. It was to see. Then he made the training harder. Targets behind vegetation. Targets partly concealed by shadows. Moving targets. Targets that punished impatience. He wanted them to understand the jungle as an enemy, not just a place. By January 30th, most of the men could hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 2-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. His job was to locate targets and protect the shooter, because George had learned the danger of the scope. When a man looks through glass, the world becomes small. Everything outside the circle disappears. A spotter kept the rest of the world alive. On February 1st, George took several teams into the field. Their mission was to clear Japanese positions west of the Matanikau River. Small groups were still operating there. Stragglers, rear guards, men covering withdrawal routes. At dawn, George and Corporal Hayes set up on high ground overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier appeared. Hayes confirmed the target. George fired. The soldier dropped. Over the next hours, George's team engaged more Japanese movement along the trail. Other teams reported success as well. The sniper section proved that George's method was not luck. It could be taught, it could be repeated, and most importantly, it could save American lives. By early February, the section had killed dozens of Japanese soldiers with no friendly casualties during those sniper operations. But the real victory was not just in the numbers. The Japanese could no longer move through the trees as if the jungle belonged only to them. The Americans had learned to look back. On February 7th, near the Tanambogo River, George's luck finally ran thin. A Japanese rifleman shot him in the left shoulder. The bullet hit hard, spun him, and knocked him down. Corporal Hayes dragged him into cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but not fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle without shattering bone or cutting a major blood vessel. Doctors treated him near Henderson Field and ordered rest. No combat for weeks. While George recovered, the Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal reached its end. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated only a short time, but it had already proven a lesson that would echo far beyond Point Cruz. Modern war still had room for individual skill, even with artillery, even with aircraft, even with machine guns and mass-produced rifles. One trained man with the right weapon, the right patience, and the right nerve could still change a battlefield. But George's war was not over. While he recovered, orders arrived from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a classified mission. Burma, jungle warfare, long-range movement. operations behind Japanese lines, the kind of mission that demanded men who could survive without clean roads, clear maps, or normal supply lines. George volunteered. By March, he was on a transport heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester was packed carefully in a waterproof case, the scope wrapped in oilcloth. The rifle that had survived Guadalcanal was going to another jungle, this time Burma. In India, George and other officers were briefed on a new unit. Thousands of men, long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, movement without ordinary supply lines. They would become known as Merrill's Marauders. The mission was brutal. Advance through northern Burma. Cross mountains, rivers, and jungle the Japanese believed no large American force could pass. No roads, limited trails, pack mules, rations carried on backs, disease everywhere. The objective was the Myitkyina airfield, a vital point for Allied supply routes into China. The march began in February of 1944. Week after week, the marauders pushed through terrain that broke men down. Malaria spread, dysentery followed, exhaustion became normal. Mules collapsed on steep trails. Men kept walking because stopping could be worse. But Burma was not Point Cruz. There were fewer clean, long-range shots. The jungle was thicker. The engagements were closer, often 50 yards or less, sometimes 30, sometimes so close that a scope mattered less than instinct. Still, George used the Winchester when the moment required it. A Japanese officer at a river crossing, a machine gun position, a sniper pinning down a patrol. Few shots, carefully chosen. Then movement. Always movement. He had learned the rule on Guadalcanal. One shot could win the moment. A second shot from the same place could get you killed. By late May, after hundreds of miles of jungle, disease, hunger, and combat, Merrill's Marauders captured Myitkyina airfield. The mission succeeded, but the cost was terrible. The unit was nearly destroyed by exhaustion and sickness. George survived Burma. So did the Winchester. But by then, he understood something important. War was changing. His bolt-action rifle had proven itself in the right hands, but the future belonged to standardized weapons, semi-automatic fire, specialized training, and organized sniper doctrine. The next generation would not depend on one man bringing his own rifle from home. But nobody could erase what happened at Point Cruz. George returned to the United States in 1944 and was assigned to training duties. He taught infantry officers marksmanship, jungle lessons, small unit tactics, and fieldcraft. He kept the Winchester. The rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee, to Guadalcanal, to India, to Burma, and back to America. It had started as a joke. Then it became a tool. Then it became a legend. After the war, John George did not spend his life chasing fame from the jungle. He studied. He worked. He built a life far from the battlefield. But he eventually wrote down what he had seen. Not as a myth, not as a superhero story, as a record. His book, Shots Fired in Anger, became one of the most respected accounts of small arms, combat lessons, and battlefield experience from World War II. It was technical, honest, precise, written by a man who had tested theory under fire and lived long enough to explain what worked. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. His Winchester Model 70, the riflemen once laughed at, was later donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. Most visitors might walk past it and see only an old hunting rifle behind glass. Wood, steel, scope, a relic. But that rifle carries a story of a young officer dismissed by men who thought standard issue meant superior, a story of patience under pressure, a story of Japanese snipers hidden high in the trees, a story of one American marksman who refused to let mockery, fear, rain, mud, traps, or jungle silence break his focus. The rifle was not magic. George was not invincible. But together, they proved something deadly and simple. In the right hands, one accurate shot can change everything. And at Point Cruz, across 4 days of rain, mud, silence, traps, and death, John George proved it 11 times. Before you leave, drop a comment with where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, anywhere in the world. Let us know. And if someone in your family served, write their name in the comments. Because stories like this are not just about weapons. They are about people, names, choices, moments when one person stood where everyone doubted him and proved that courage does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes courage is quiet. Sometimes it waits in the mud. Sometimes it looks through a small scope from a ruined bunker. And sometimes it changes history with a single shot.